Welcome to the image analysis for the elbow. Let's start with the AP projection. Image analysis guidelines for the AP projection of the elbow state that the medial and lateral humeral epicondyles are demonstrated in profile. 1/8 of the radial head superimposes the ulna. The radial tuberosity is demonstrated in profile medially. The radius and ulna are parallel. The elbow joint space should be demonstrated as open. The radial head articulating surface is not demonstrated. The olecranon process is situated within the olecranon fossa. The elbow joint is at the center of the exposure field. The elbow joint, 1/4 of the proximal forearm and distal humerus and the lateral soft tissue are all to be included within the exposure field. I have included those image analysis guidelines within the presentation. So let's talk about our anatomical misalignments. Let's talk about, in the AP projection, internal rotation, where the hand is not fully supinated and we're not in that true AP projection, or external rotation, where we might be slightly over rotated externally, where our hand is supinated and maybe our thumb is a little too far externally rotated out. If the humeral epicondyles are not positioned in profile for the AP elbow projection, more than 1/8 of the radial head is superimposed over the ulna. And the elbow will be demonstrated as an internal rotation. As you can see in the first projection, that is example of our internal rotation. The radial head is more than 1/8 superimposed by the ulna. If the humeral epicondyles are not positioned in profile in our second example for the AP elbow projection, and less than 1/8 of the radial head, is superimposed over the ulna, the elbow has been externally rotated. That is bringing that radial head, neck, and tuberosity away, and that's what happens when we do the external oblique. We're trying to free that up of superimposition. However, we do want to see 1/8 of the radial head superimposed over the ulna in the AP projection. So let's look at our first practice analysis. We can tell this is not in a true AP projection because we're going to refer back to the relationship of the radial head to the ulna. The radial head is superimposed by more than 1/8 over the ulna. Also, the humeral epicondyles are not in profile. This means that the elbow is internally or medially rotated. In order to correct this positioning error, we need to rotate the elbow externally until the humeral epicondyles are parallel with the IR. So let's take a look at our second practice analysis. Again, we have some degree of rotation for the true AP projection. The humeral epicondyles are not in profile. Our relationship between the radial head and ulna are not sufficient. As a matter of fact, the radial head is superimposing the ulna at less than 1/8. So in this case, the elbow is laterally rotated or externally rotated. We need to rotate the elbow internally until those humeral epicondyles are parallel with the IR. Let's take a look at this third practice analysis. Our epicondyles are demonstrated somewhat parallel with the IR. However, when you take a look at the relationship of the radial head and olecranon process, we don't see the olecranon fossa on end, and we don't see the process clearly demonstrated in an AP projection. This should tell us that the distal humerus here is demonstrated without foreshortening. So it is parallel with the IR. However, that proximal forearm is elevated. It's as if the humerus is parallel, but the proximal forearm, the patient doesn't have it in contact with the IR. So in order to correct this imaging error, we need to fully extend the elbow. If the patient is unable to extend the elbow, this could be an acceptable projection. However, a second AP projection of the elbow should be taken with the forearm position parallel with the IR. So let's move on to our AP oblique projections, a medial and lateral rotation. Image analysis guidelines for the AP oblique projection, specifically with the medial rotation, state that the coronoid process, trochlear notch, and medial aspect of the trochlea are demonstrated in profile. 3/4 of the radial head should superimpose the ulna. The trochlea and coronoid process joint space is demonstrated as open. The coronoid process articulating surface is not demonstrated. The elbow joint should be demonstrated at the center of the exposure field. The elbow joint, 1/4 of the proximal forearm, distal humerus, and lateral soft tissue are all to be included within the exposure field. Image analysis guidelines for the AP oblique lateral oblique projection, state that capitulum and the radial head are seen in profile. The ulna is demonstrated without radial head, neck, and tuberosity superimposition. The radial ulnar joint should be demonstrated as open. The capitulum radial head joint space is open, and the radial head articulating surface is not demonstrated. The elbow joint should be at the center of the exposure field, and the elbow joint, 1/4 of the proximal forearm and distal humerus, and the lateral soft tissue are all to be included within the exposure field. I have included those image analysis guidelines within this presentation. So let's take a look at, in a medial oblique, insufficient medial obliquity versus excessive medial obliquity. And this is for, again, the medial oblique. If the humeral epicondyles are at less than 45 degrees of obliquity with the IR for that medial oblique elbow, less than 3/4 of the radial head will superimpose over the ulna, as you can see in this insufficient medial oblique image. In excessive medial obliquity, the humeral epicondyles are at more than 45 degrees of obliquity with the IR, then more than 3/4 of the radial head will superimpose over the ulna, as you can see in the second image demonstrating excessive medial obliquity. Now let's take a look at the lateral oblique, or external oblique. In the external oblique, where there's insufficient medial obliquity, the humeral epicondyles will be at less than 45 degrees of obliquity with the IR for the lateral projection, or the external oblique projection. The radial head and or radial tuberosity will still partially superimpose the ulna, as demonstrated in the first projection. In excessive medial obliquity, the humeral epicondyles are at more than 45 degrees of obliquity with the IR for the external projection. The coronoid process will be seen partially superimposing the radial head, the radial tuberosity, and ulna demonstrate no superimposition, and the radial tuberosity is no longer in partial profile, as demonstrated in the second projection. So let's take a look at our first practice analysis. We're going to take a look right here for the most part. The capitulum in this projection at radial joint space is demonstrated as closed. Also, we can see the radial head articulating surface is demonstrated. You can look at this elbow and see that there is some type of bend in the elbow. So this automatically lets me know that the forearm is not positioned parallel with the IR. In order to correct this imaging error, we need to fully extend that elbow. If the patient fully extend the elbow and reposition the patient to make sure that that elbow, the distal forearm and humerus is parallel with the IR for that lateral or external oblique projection. So let's take a look at our second projection. We can see that the radial head here is entirely superimposed on the ulna. This means for this medial oblique or internal oblique elbow that the elbow obliquity was more than 45 degrees. We want to decrease the degree of internal obliquity until those humeral epicondyles are at an angle that is of 45 degrees with the IR. So for our last image analysis, we're going to take a look at an external oblique or lateral oblique projection. When evaluating this, at first glance, it almost looks like an AP projection. I would almost say that, you know, we are insufficiently obliqued. The radial head, neck, and tuberosity here are still demonstrating superimposition by the ulna. So therefore, in order to correct this imaging positioning error, we need to increase the degree of obliquity so that those humeral epicondyles are sitting at a 45-degree oblique with the IR.